For those that are just tuning in, either having just arrived or who are just turning on the recording now, we've been talking about a question of being able to do it all. And in particular, since we happen to have an all-women's group today, by coincidence, a woman trying to be able to do it all. Can you have family? Can you have work? What sacrifices need to be made? And I swear it wasn't a plant. But this is a wonderful topic to begin the discussion with, because it is, I hope, going to lead us in some of the themes of our study today, because we are in Parashat Behalotekha, and there are many different episodes in Behalotekha, many very interesting and very compelling sections from this parasha. But the section that we're going to look at is actually chapter 12, which is found on page 833. It's chapter 12 of the book of Numbers of Bamidbar. If you're on the Eitz Chaim Chumash, it's 833. And it's the chapter that is going to deal with, well, primarily with Miriam. And as we're going to see, it's a very interesting case of perhaps women's issues, of the relationship between women, the relationship between wives and husbands, the relationship between brothers and sisters. And it is also rather hard to untangle of what is happening in this episode and why. So we're going to take the story apart first, and we'll use some of the commentators to help us understand it, and hopefully use our own life experiences to help us understand the commentators as they help us understand. And we'll see what we can get from this. Sound like a plan? Excellent. Who'd like to start us off in the Torah text? Please, Edie. Great.
Okay, 12?
That's right.
Okay. When they were in Hazeroth, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman he had married. He married a Cushite woman.
Okay. What's the problem?
He married a Cushite woman.
Okay, so hold on a second. I want to show you something here that I used to like doing with my students in Japan. There are many, many sentences on the board. Looks like just one, right? Mm-hmm. But I could say, let's do some color here. He married a Cushite woman, which would mean the problem was he, that Moses plus Cushite equals bad. It could be that it's something specific about Moses being with a Cushite woman that is a problem, that if it wasn't Moses, that if it was just Frank, that it would be fine. And then it wouldn't be a problem. So he might be the emphasis. Or it could be he married a Cushite woman, in which case the problem would be that something about Cushites just themselves is a problem. And that if he had married someone else, no problem. But by marrying a Cushite, that in and of itself was an issue. Even if it had been Frank, marrying a Cushite woman would be a problem. That's another way to read this same sentence. Another way to read it would be, he married a Cushite woman. And this one's a little bit maybe harder to guess, but there might be some marriage trouble at the heart of the problem. That there's something about the marriage, and nothing about Moses in particular, maybe we'll see, nothing necessarily about her being Cushite, maybe, but there's something that happens with this marriage that is an issue. And that's what there's a problem with. Does this make sense so far? So just because it says he married a Cushite woman doesn't mean we can automatically assume that we understand what their problem is, that they are complaining about. Make sense? Yes? No? Maybe? Now's the time to complain if it doesn't. Okay, so we're going to have to dig deeper, and we're going to have to try and uncover what could possibly be the issue. By the way, what is literally a Cushite? I'll give you a hint. What's an Israelite?
Person from
A person from Israel. So, and what's a Canaanite?
Somebody from Canaan.
Someone from Canaan. So what's a Cushite?
Somebody from Cush.
Somebody from Cush. What's Cush? What's that?
Ethiopia?
Okay, it's the area around what is now modern-day Ethiopia and Sudan. So it's an area in Africa that is in the area, the vicinity of modern-day Ethiopia and Sudan. Make sense? We got our geography online. But what do we know about Moses' wife? What's her name, by the way?
Zipporah.
Zipporah. But Zipporah, was she from Ethiopia?
No.
Where's she from? Where does he meet her? What?
Midian.
She is a Midianite, not a Cushite. We see that very clearly. Her father Jethro is one of the priests of Midian. I mean, he is in Midian. It's very explicit that Zipporah is from Midian. So when we're saying that he married a Cushite woman, who, what, where, is that Zipporah? Is that two? Is this a second wife that goes unnamed? Is, in the middle of all the time at Mount Sinai, he happened to meet a passing Cushite and they decided to get hitched? What in the world's going on here? What in the world's going on here? Good. We confused? Excellent.
Thoroughly.
That's the place to start. Okay, so let's take a look and see a little bit more about the complaint, and maybe that will help us unravel it, and then we'll let the commentators help us.
They said, "Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well?" The Lord heard it. Now Moses was a very humble man, more so than any other man on earth.
Okay, well, that makes things a lot clearer, right?
I don't think
Has
so.
the Lord spoken only through Moses? How in the world does that fit with a Cushite wife? How does it matter who God talks to get married to?
They don't seem to have anything to do with each other.
They really don't, right? On the surface, as a hint, they don't seem to have anything whatsoever to do with itself. It's, Moses married a Cushite woman, and God talks to us too. Okay, so the very simple way to answer these questions, the ultimate sort of just discarding the details and taking it at only the most plain face value, is this is a brother and sister who are griping about their brother. And you know what? They're in a gripe fest mode. They're just going to mention everything that they're unhappy with. He married a woman we don't like, and he's always putting on airs, and he thinks that he's so great, but God talks to us too, doesn't he? Moses, our younger brother, blah, 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 blah. They may just be in gripe mode. Right? Yeah. I think it's not too hard to imagine that brothers and sisters may occasionally complain about one another. We've seen movies about that, even if we've never experienced it in our own personal lives. But we've heard tell that this can happen. And perhaps that's what's happening. Our tradition doesn't like to settle for an answer like that, though, because it likes to believe that the Torah has been put together very carefully and has been put together in a way that teaches more than just brothers and sisters sometimes complain. So we'll see if we can't tease out some more meaning, but first we got to get more of the story.
Suddenly the Lord called to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, "Come out, you three, to the tent of meeting." So the three of them went out. The Lord came down in a pillar of cloud, stopped at the entrance of the tent, and called out, "Aaron and Miriam." The two of them came forward and said, "Hear these my words. When a prophet of the Lord arises among you, I make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is trusted throughout my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, plainly and not in riddles, and he beholds the likeness of the Lord. How then did you not shrink from speaking against my servant Moses? Still incensed with them, the Lord departed."
All right, pause button. God's a little ticked. Why?
In a sense, they were questioning him.
Questioning who, him? Pronouns are dangerous.
Okay, they were questioning God.
They were questioning God. Because
Miriam and Aaron.
if they were criticizing Moses for something, and if they were comparing themselves to Moses in the process of leveling that criticism by saying, but doesn't God talk to us as well? Then by extension, they are criticizing God for allowing Moses to have some distinction that he doesn't deserve, because after all three of them are subject to heavenly visions. And how does God set them straight?
Talking to Aaron and Miriam.
By talking to Aaron and Miriam and pointing out what?
But Moses is different.
That Moses is different. That they may have a hard time understanding this because God has come to them, but God doesn't speak to them the way he speaks to Moses. And they may have a hard time understanding that somebody could be on a higher spiritual plane than them, when after all, God is talking to them. But there is, and he's called Moses. And he may be their brother, but he's also the only person in all of human history that speaks to God in this particular type of clarity. Everyone else, it's visions, riddles, and dreams. Moses, it's a clear vision.
At that time, were there any rules against marrying out of Judaism?
At that time, were there any rules against marrying out of Judaism? Yes and no.
Was there a Judaism?
Well, there certainly was a Judaism. There was the covenant made at Sinai. There was the notion of the Bnei Israel, the people of Israel. But there was also the notion that people could join that congregation, that community. So bringing someone into your household that was an active idolater, big problem. You know, you invite someone into your house, you marry them, and they set up a shrine to another god, we've got a problem. But marrying someone and bringing them into the fold of Judaism and having them become one of the nation, that's perfectly permissible at this time period as well as on our contemporary time period. So if he had married somebody who refused to adopt the ways of Judaism, the ways of Torah, then that would definitely be cause for Aaron and Miriam to be upset. But do we imagine that Moses would have married someone who brought pagan worship into his tent? It's very hard to imagine that circumstance, that sort of that eventuality. And it's even harder to imagine God coming to Moses' defense if that's what he had done. Because make no mistakes, God is backing Moses up 100% here.
But didn't Moses marry Zipporah when he was a young boy fleeing from Egypt?
When he was a young man of 40. Thank you very much for calling that a young boy.
You know something? It is. It is. But it was a different time in his life.
Mhm.
He wasn't a leader then.
Okay, so if the Cushite is Zipporah, then perhaps what you're suggesting is that Miriam and Aaron are now saying, look, Zipporah was fine when you were just a guy.
Yeah.
But now that you're the leader of our people, you know, you married her before we got Torah, you married her before your experience of God.
Mhm.
Maybe she's not fit for you now. And maybe you should marry someone who is an Israelite. And, you know, just send
Isn't
her.
it interesting that in all the talk about Moses,
Mhm.
he has no children?
Well, he does have children, and they do get mentioned elsewhere.
Yeah.
But long
But
term.
they don't come into prominence.
Correct. And that is very interesting. I think it has less to do with his wife and more to do with trying to avoid the cult of leadership.
Yeah.
That leadership was supposed to be earned more than inherited.
Mhm.
But that's a much longer conversation.
Okay.
Let's get back to the nitty-gritty of the household argument.
Okay.
Because what does God do apart from chewing them out? Keep reading.
As the cloud withdrew from the tent, there was Miriam stricken with snow-white scales. When Aaron Aaron turned
That's the
toward-
tzara'at, the skin affliction that we've seen before, that is often translated as leprosy.
Okay.
Yeah, woof.
Hold that thought.
I will hold it.
When Aaron turned toward Miriam, he saw that she was stricken with scales. And Aaron said to Moses, "O my Lord, account not to us the sin which we committed in our folly. Let her not be as one dead, who emerges from his mother's womb with half his flesh eaten away." So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "O God, pray heal her."
All right.
But the Lord
Up,
said...
hold on a second.
Okay.
You had a question about this, or a comment at least.
The way, in fact, we were just studying this at conference,
Mm-hmm.
that the scales were not leprosy, which was the first thought,
Right.
but it was something of spirituality.
Yes. And when we discussed tzara'at earlier on, when we were looking at the book of Leviticus and Vayikra, we did talk about how tzara'at is not a medical condition, but a spiritual condition. And that seems to be made even more plain here, that she is afflicted with this as a result of a spiritual failing in her interaction with her brother.
Why not Aaron as well?
And why am I only saying she? And why does the Torah only say she?
Yeah.
Why isn't it they? Why didn't they both have this affliction? And that's a wonderful question that we are going to wrestle with. But I want to just put that one on pause until we can look at some of the commentary. Any other questions or comments before we get to the end game of this episode? All right, let's finish it off.
But the Lord said to Moses, "If her father spat in her face, would she not bear her shame for 7 days? Let her be shut out of camp for 7 days, and then let her be readmitted." So Miriam was shut out of camp 7 days, and the people did not march on until Miriam was readmitted. After that, the people set out from Hazeroth and encamped in the wilderness of Paran.
Okay. Let's go ahead and get the copies along. So we got a lot of questions here. We've got, what are they arguing about? What does it have to do with him being a Cushite wife? What does it have to do with the relationship between them and Moses and God and each of them as prophets? What does it have to do with Miriam being punished and not Aaron? What's going on here? A lot of questions. Let's see if we can't unpack it a little bit. All right, so who'd like to take us through our first midrashic explanation? Anyone want to volunteer? Please.
Miriam and Aaron spoke.
All right, now that little FS behind there, and it might help if you turn back to page 833 to verse 1. In the first verse there, it says Vatidaber Miriam, right? And that is in the feminine singular form. So even though it says Vatidaber Miriam ve'Aharon and Aaron, the verb itself is in the feminine form. Does that make sense? We all, remember that much about Hebrew, that Hebrew has feminine forms and masculine forms and singular forms and plural forms and all of that. So it seems to be in the singular form here, which is unusual. Because why would it be in singular even though there are two of them? And the Midrash answers, keep reading now from the handout.
She spoke first.
Why does it use her as the subject of the verb? Because she's the one that spoke first.
Therefore, Scripture mentions her first. How did she know that Moses had separated from his wife?
Wait, what? Who did what to who now?
Yeah.
All right, so keep reading and we're going to unpack this Midrash.
Would that be Rabbi
Yes.
Natan says Miriam was beside Zipporah when Moses was told that Eldad and Nadab were prophesying in the camp. When Zipporah heard this, she said, "Woe to their wives if they are required to prophesy, for they will separate from their wives just as my husband separated from me." From this Miriam knew and told Aaron.
Okay, so if you have been reading the whole parasha up to this point, in the previous chapter there was an episode where some of Moses' spirit of prophecy is transferred to others in the camp, and in particular, two guys, Eldad and Medad, get part of this gift, this ability to prophesy. And the story goes, the Midrash has, that Miriam and Zipporah happen to be together when Moses gets the word that these two guys are still doing their prophecy thing. And Zipporah laments on behalf of their wives. It'll be terrible for their wives if they continue to prophesy, because if they do, then they'll have to separate. The implication being, from Zipporah's experience,
The prophets don't have time for their wives.
that prophets, with their wives. Why they're not with their wives, we'll have to deal with. It could be because they don't have time, that they're just too busy, as the argument and discussion before class began about whether you can really have time to do it all. It could just be that with a prophet, there's no time for the spouse. But in any event, it seems to be from Zipporah's experience that Moses is not with her. And by with her, I do mean what the euphemism would imply. That Zipporah is saying their poor wives, their husbands will never be intimate with them again if they continue to prophesy. And the parentheses is, just like my husband Moses is never with me. Does that make sense? Okay, so by juxtaposing this story with the previous chapter, the Midrash says, what could Zipporah have been upset about? She could have been upset about the separation between her and her husband. And then Miriam steps in. Why? Why does Miriam know that this complaint of Zipporah seems to be an illegitimate complaint or something that shouldn't have to continue?
If she was with her,
Mm-hmm.
they may have been friends.
They may have been friends, exactly. But what does Miriam know from her own experience about being a prophetess with regards to spousal relations?
She's never described as having a husband.
Well, we're sort of assuming from this particular midrash, and we're also assuming, of course, that Aaron does have a wife, although we do get that explicit, because kids and all. They don't just pop out of his skull. But it means that from Miriam's experience and her experience with Aaron, prophets don't separate from their spouses. She's never separated from her husband. Aaron never separated from his wife. Why should poor Zipporah have to be separated from her husband, from Moses? So Miriam is indignant that Moses is keeping Zipporah apart from him when, as far as Miriam is concerned, there's no reason for it. You follow that line of logic? Right?
Yeah.
She hears her sister-in-law complaining, or lamenting more than a complaint, about the separation that is inevitable between a prophet and their spouse. And Miriam says, there's no inevitable separation involved. I'm a prophetess, and my husband and I, as often as we like. And Aaron, with his wife, no problem. So what's my brother doing to his poor wife? Why did he tell her that they're not allowed to be together? Get the way the gossip starts? See that little process? You hear one comment from someone, you begin to interpret it by your own experience, and then you share it with someone else just because you're trying to help find a solution to the problem. Sure. And suddenly you've got this whole thing of, Moses isn't treating his wife right. Make sense? Yes? Familiar style of human interaction? Yeah? 3,000 years later, we're still doing much of the same thing?
Far back.
Yeah, as far back and unfortunately far into the future until we get it right. Okay, but let's go ahead and see though, because we still have this problem of, well, but what is this whole terminology of a Cushite doing with all of this in the first place? Okay, so keep reading.
Now Miriam, who did not intend to disparage him, was punished, all the more so someone who disparages his fellow.
That's actually just a little insert from the same midrash that's trying to remind us that Miriam got the tzaraat stick thrown at her, and she wasn't necessarily trying to be bad-mouthing Moses. She was trying to help her sister-in-law. So all the more so, our tradition says, if you deliberately say something negative or impolite about another person, or is critical of their personal and private affairs, intentionally trying to cause them embarrassment, shame, or otherwise hurt them, you will suffer even worse than Miriam did. So keep your mouth shut. But let's go on to the Cushite aspect.
Cushite woman. Scripture teaches us that everyone acknowledged her beauty, just as everyone acknowledges a Cushite's blackness.
Okay, so first answer of what Cushite means. Cushite means pretty. Got that? Following the logic here? Cushite, meaning Ethiopian, means pretty because just as a Cushite is black, and that's obvious or undeniable, so too is Zipporah pretty. Follow that nice little circle of thinking? So when it says his Cushite wife, what it really means is his undeniably beautiful wife. And Cushite's just a shorthand for that. Yay? Nay? Meh? Meh? Not seeing a lot of love for this interpretation.
Why would Cushite and beautiful be connected with all people?
Well, yes.
This particular woman is pretty, but why would that be connected with all people?
You mean why not just say pretty? His pretty wife? Well, why use a term for an entire nation of people just as an adjective for pretty in this case with this woman? And that is one of the reasons why this is not the only answer that is presented by our tradition. Yes? Question?
Yeah, there's another tribe, or it's a name that's escaping me, near Egypt, where the women and the men are extremely attractive. And they're black, very black.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not Ethiopia.
Eritrean? I
No,
don't...
no. It's, we call them pretty in our eyes because they have Anglo features.
Right, they
They
match
don't-
our cultural perception
Yes.
of beauty.
Exactly. They don't have, the heavy lips
Mhm.
and the facial structure of Africans.
Right, we do have a cultural bias in every culture of
Exactly.
judging beauty based upon their
Right.
closeness to our cultural ideal of beauty.
And I'm trying to remember the name of that group of people because we saw them going down the Nile.
Okay, I don't know. I haven't heard of that. So thank you for sharing that snippet. Now you just have to give me the
Now I
punchline. It's like telling me half the joke and not quite getting the punchline,
I
but
forgot the punchline, right.
look it up, and when it comes to you, let me know.
Okay.
Okay, so, but just to try and reinforce this notion that Cushite means pretty, we get a little gematric proof text. And remember, gematria is the way of using letters as numbers, and then finding similar words that happen to have the same sum total value. If you could. Don't worry about the Hebrew, just Nubian.
Nubians.
Okay.
It's, okay.
That's it.
Its
Just-
numerical value is equal to,
Beautiful in appearance.
okay.
Yifat Mareh. So the word Cushite and the Hebrew word Yifat Mareh happens to be both the same numerical value, 736. You got that?
Yes.
So if you look at the letters, and the math is there for you, of what each letter is equal to. If you add it all up, you end up with 736. So therefore, Cushite and beautiful appearance are in fact linked through the numbers. And so to say that she was called Cushite to tell you she was pretty, or undeniably pretty, makes perfect sense, right? We're done, we can go home.
Not so fast.
Not convinced? Not
so
100%
fast.
convinced
Not
yet?
so fast.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and see maybe there was some other aspect. Keep going.
For he had married a Cushite Cushite woman. What does this redundant phrase mean to say? You find a woman who is beautiful in appearance, but unpleasant indeed, or a woman who is pleasant indeed, but not of beautiful appearance. This one, however, was pleasant in every respect.
All right, so if you notice in that very first verse, there's this phrase. It says they spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. The way the translation in the Eitz Chaim gets around that redundancy is by using the age-old technique of quotation marks. So they take that redundant phrase and they make it as what Miriam said to Aaron. He married a Cushite woman. But there are no quotes in Hebrew. There isn't any physical symbols of quotes in the Torah itself. And therefore that's a decision by the translator to interpret the redundant phrase as being the actual statement of their conversation, of their gossip, essentially. But you could equally read it in alternative ways. And one of the ways that Tanchuma, the Midrashic collection, reads it is by saying, by repeating it, they're saying she was beautiful and she was a good person. Because sometimes there are people who only get one or the other aspect right. But by repeating this, they're saying she was good and beautiful, not just beautiful or good. So you didn't have to say she just has a nice personality or she's pretty. She's the whole package. But we're still then working with the idea that Cushite is somehow reinforcing the notion of her beauty. Yes?
She was called the Cushite on account of her beauty, as a man would call his handsome son Cushite to negate the power of the evil eye.
Got that?
That contradicts exactly what the previous.
Well, no, not exactly. I mean, it contradicts the notion that we're using the word Cushite because she was as obviously pretty as a Cushite is black. It contradicts that aspect, but it still says that the word Cushite is being used to let you know that she's pretty. But how do we know now that she's pretty from this usage of the word Cushite?
Because they're describing her as Cushite to avoid the evil eye.
What's the evil eye?
When something is too good, you don't want to call attention to it.
Exactly. If something's too
because-
good, you don't want to call attention because it
Right.
will create jealousy and animosity among others. So you call it by a disparaging name,
Right.
which means in this case, Cushite would mean,
Black.
and therefore black was considered to be
Not so good.
not so good. All right. This is not what you would call a racially sensitive opinion.
Right.
This is, our ancestors thousands of years ago, and they were perhaps speaking more plainly than we would like, but they're saying, we generally think that somebody who is black in appearance is less attractive than someone who isn't. And so if we want to use a term that's the opposite of what we mean in order to avoid the evil eye, we'll call someone a Cushite rather than pretty directly. And you'll know they're pretty because I took the effort to call them something that wasn't pretty in my eyes. Not nice, and not a very nice way to describe an entire nation of people, but the intent is still, she was pretty.
Is there a connection to the idea of changing one's Hebrew name when one is ill?
It's not precisely with regards to the evil eye, which is usually focused much more around jealousy and the interaction, but the idea that names can influence how you are treated and how the world impacts you. There is a similarity there, yes. Okay, so how about just the straight answer, right? What's the alternative on the back page?
She was from the family of Ham, as is written in the Chronicles of Moses, that Moses ruled 40 years in the land of Cush, and took the queen of Cush for a wife.
There we go. Simple explanation, right? Moses lived in Ethiopia for 40 years, and while he was there, he was married to the queen. So when it says she was a Cushite, we mean she was from Cush. That she was a descendant from Ham, one of Noah's sons, and from which the Cushite line eventually came. So, yep, she was a Cushite. This was a separate wife, different than Zipporah, and she was the queen of Cush, and she was black. Just, that's what it was. And that's who the argument is about. So this is Rashbam's solution to this, based upon another Midrashic collection called the Chronicles of Moses. And this is a rather, what's the right term to use? It's not too disparaging. Outlandish collection of tales of Moses' life, like that he lived in Ethiopia for 40 years and was married to the queen. Not exactly something that's made it into the average collection of stories about Moses' life. So it's what you might call outside mainstream in terms of the general retelling of Moses' 40 years between leaving Egypt and returning to Egypt. But Rashbam finds it to be the simplest explanation of what does it mean to say that she was married to a Cushite? It means he was married to a woman from Ethiopia. Done. You look.
Does that appear any place
In Torah?
Torah?
No, not at all. There's no indication in Torah that Moses ever spent any time in Cush, in Ethiopia. It's just not there at all. And there's no description of any children that would have come between him and this Ethiopian queen wife. But as far as this particular verse in the Torah goes, one might be tempted to say that the word Cush just means what it says it means, that this was a Cushite wife.
For if the Torah were referring to Zipporah, why would it state that Moses had married a Cushite woman, since we already know that Zipporah is a Midianite? Moreover, she was not a Cushite for Cush. Oh, for Cush is the son of Ham, and Midian is the son of Keturah, and of the children of Abraham.
Right, so if you go back to all the genealogies in the Torah, you can see that Midian comes from Keturah, which was the woman that Abraham had children with after Sarah died. Go back and read Chaya Sarah if you want to get more details on that. So it's clear that Zipporah, as the daughter of Midian, could not be in any way, shape, form, sense, or possible explanation be called a Cushite as far as ethnicity or nationality is concerned. So if the Torah is speaking plainly, which Rashbam really, really prefers to read that plain meaning of Torah rather than going to too many additional interpretations, then we have to assume that this Cushite woman was not Zipporah, even though the bulk of Midrash tends to assume that it was. How we doing? He's a lone voice in the wilderness. Get it? Bamidbar, wilderness. Yeah, okay. How we doing?
If this woman was not mentioned in the Torah,
Mm-hmm.
why would this information be inserted?
And that's part of the problem, is that if she's not mentioned anywhere else, nowhere else do we get any indication that Moses had more than one wife, and nowhere do we hear of any other children by this other wife. It does seem rather implausible that this story would be talking about a different woman, or would be talking about a completely separate wife. On the other hand, the fact that it uses the term Cushite, which is so different than Midian, forces Rashbam to conclude it must be a different woman, even if we never have heard about her before and would never hear about her again.
Except, this one little
Mm-hmm.
explanation here. It's Cushan is a Midianite tribe.
Which, if you would be so kind as to read the next source text on my handout.
Right. That
I saw the tense, yeah, that line.
Yes.
Go ahead and read that out loud.
I saw the tents of Cushan under distress. The 10 curtains of the land of Midian were trembling.
Okay,
So we're talking now about the same thing.
in the
the
prophecies
word.
of Habakkuk,
Yeah.
he talks about one of the groups of Midianites known as Cushan.
Mhm.
And the argument for this interpretation is when the Torah says Cushite here, they're not talking about Ethiopian Cush, they're talking about Midian Cushan. And They sound very, very similar, but that doesn't mean they are very, very similar. It just happens to be that the names are similar. But she would have been therefore a Midian just as we already knew, and it would clearly be Tzipporah, and it would be no problem whatsoever. And
There's
all of
still
this,
a problem, but only with one wife.
well, there's still a problem for what is the issue between Moses and his brother and sister and all of that, but the issue of Cush is no longer a problem because it's just another synonym for Midian. And then we are able to incorporate their complaint into a much more, a smoother line of argument, a smoother line of attack against him. And the ethnicity of his wife drops out as an issue. And that no longer is part of the main issue. They're just talking about what he does with his wife in the privacy of their tent, which is still not something they're supposed to be talking about, but they're not really talking about her ethnicity anymore if we read Cushite as really being from Cushan, being part of Midian. Does that make sense? How the prophecy of Habakkuk, that usage of the word Cushan, smooths this over quite nicely? Maybe? Yes?
Well, it makes it clear that we're talking about Zipporah, but it doesn't entirely
Solve why they're complaining.
Yeah.
Yes.
But also, they could still be complaining when he was not in his mother.
So, which absolutely take out the issue of her specific ethnicity, whether or not the fact that she was an issue. That is to become instead whether just complaining someone outside the tribe, that could still be that we would no longer on other ethnicity married. It would just us and everyone opposed to they're okay, they're not. That dynamic disappears if we read this as just being still Zipporah, another Midianite from Cushan, and that's all we're talking about. And that does actually help smooth out the rest of the argument. So we're going to just continue. Who was reading last? Marion, I think you were reading. Go ahead and read the last two commentaries here from Tanhuma.
Hasn't he spoken to us too? Yet we have not abstained from marital relations.
Okay, so what we end up, I'll go ahead and keep reading, and I'll map this out for us.
Suddenly, he revealed himself to them suddenly when they were ritually unclean, following marital relations, and they cried, "Water, water." He thus showed them that Moses had done right in separating from his wife, since the divine presence revealed itself to him frequently, and there was no set time for divine communication.
Okay, so here's the map of the family relations. Eldad and Medad start prophesying. According to this, Zipporah hears about it and says, "Oh, too bad for their wives." Miriam hears what Zipporah says, and she tells Aaron. And the two of them say, well, why would Moses have separated from Zipporah? Because that's what Zipporah wives are going to do. Because this can be with us. So Moses is very humble. He's not going to stand up for himself. He's not going to point out, that's not exactly the motive. Instead, God stepped in it. But does what, according to our last midrash here? Not the happens, but the water thing.
There's no time.
There's no time, which is if you have a pager and it can beep at any moment, and you go, whoops, God, you do not have time to run to the mikveh, yourself, go stand, you have to be 20, and you know what? That with your spouse, because this level of someone standing in the presence of God, you have to go through the words. Essentially, calls them out, literally, at a time when they can't show up in front of God without it for first. Doing that, God, see, He has. You see, you had to stop, go to the mikveh, get yourself purified, and that's for my number one guy. That's very thoughtful to see poor the relation. Very thoughtful. Explain it that way. What I mean by that? You would think, so then no more. Moses. Moses got up for Moses. Says there is a person who had to doesn't get that excuse. Should. Of being out of all upon his wife because of his, no matter how holy you, no matter how much Moses, leave that for leadership of the people to God, to the world, very, very on top of the people. He had to do have the every couple would have, and that's sad. But we should also understand that's a unique position for any nation to be, and they be moderation that one does. Celibacy, not a chance. It's a requirement of a good relationship, intimate with one another. Questions? Comments? Important takeaway apart from the good with our spouse, shut and about someone's relationship. Don't gossip and don't, go, I wonder if who do they think they are? Keep it. Shut.
It's interesting that God would take the trouble to go through this whole process to explain why things are like that. It's such a small incident.
Well, it seems a small incident, and
people attacking you.
And we can wonder.
God meant it for everyone.
Exactly, and we can wonder, wow, God would bother to help Moses with his trouble with his sister and brother, but yes, God would bother to help, and I think God rather tries to help us as well. But I think, as you added at the very end, all the more so by helping Moses in this incident, he was also making sure that the rest of us would understand what requirements we had and what limits to what we could talk about other people we also had. And so God was setting a precedent here, not just to solve Moses' problem, but to help all the rest of us in the years that follow.
Miriam is reprimanded twice. that I know of
Mm-hmm.
in the Torah.
Yes.
And yet she's, one of our first.
Of course. But you
But-
think to be
but
a
she's not
hero,
perfect.
to be a hero, you have to be perfect? No. No, we don't do that.
I
Remember,
know,
even
it's
Moses,
really amazing.
even Moses gets reprimanded.
Right. Moses' reprimand is much more severe than hers, I
Well,
would
compared to
think.
what he hoped for, yes. But
Right.
compared to how it actually affects him, he gets 120 years of good life, leading a nation and bringing Torah and having a closeness to God. All he doesn't get to do is step 5 feet over a line. It's not exactly the world's worst punishment objectively, but as it felt to him, yes, was enormous.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.